Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have a fairly remarkable guest. So this is Nicholas Maxwell, and Nicholas Maxwell is the Emeritus Reader in Philosophy of Science at University College London, but he was also a professor there for, I believe, over 30 years. He's the author of Karl Popper, Science and Enlightenment, but also the author of, I believe, 12 odd other books on the philosophy of science, on Karl Popper, and on a number of other interesting subjects that we're going to get to today. So, first of all, Nicholas Maxwell, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
A pleasure.
I might get us to start in a personal question, actually, because I've read through a lot of your work in preparation for this, and there's some remarkable personal stories that you had with Karl Popper himself. So I might get you to start there, actually. There's a couple, you sat in seminars of Karl Popper's, you challenged him, you asked him questions, and he responded to you, which is a fairly remarkable thing from Karl Popper. So I might get you to start there, if that's okay.
Okay. I was doing philosophy at Manchester University in my third year, which was more or less devoted to Oxford philosophy, which I found unrelentingly trivial and appalling, so much so that I didn't go to lectures. I didn't want to be brainwashed by this dreadful stuff. And then I discovered Karl Popper, who seemed to me to be really interesting and talking about really important problems. And what he had to say about science I found absolutely fascinating. I'd been sort of myself thinking somewhat along similar lines, and I rushed down to the library and tried to read The Logic of Scientific Discovery. And then I miraculously got my degree, and I decided I would do an MA thesis and then get the hell out of this madhouse of academia. And I decided to become an occasional student at the LSE and attended Popper's seminars and found Popper fascinating, rather terrifying. Every time he opened his mouth, he seemed to me to say really interesting things that were sort of at odds with all the usual rubbish one normally heard. And then I went down to, I got a job teaching philosophy of science at University College London, and I used to attend Popper's seminars, and I was asked to give a seminar. I think this is what you're referring to. And at the LSE in Popper's seminar. So I gave it on what I was thinking about then, physics and common sense. How do we understand the world as we experience it, embedded in the physical universe? Giving a talk at Popper's seminar was a harrowing experience. I witnessed many another speaker almost reduced to tears by the unrelenting, savage, critical scrutiny that every word almost received. So I sort of thought, well, perhaps I won't do it quite like that. And so what happened was that I sat at the top of a long table. I had Popper on my left-hand side and John Watkins on my right-hand side. I would utter a sentence. Popper would object furiously. Then Watkins would say, no, Karl, that's not what Maxwell is saying. So they would sort of argue it out and then eventually realize the absurdity of what they were doing, because there I was to clarify. So they both finally turned to me. And indeed, the next sentence of my talk did clarify exactly what they were debating. And then I uttered the next sentence, and the same thing happened again, and that's how we proceeded. And then at a certain point I said, the mind is the brain. I hold that with reservations, because I think there's more to the mind than just the physics of the brain. And Popper exploded and said, what sort of thesis is that? So I said, it's a bold conjecture. And the whole seminar erupted in laughter because, of course, bold conjecture is one of Popper's phrases. Popper muttered, it's not so bold as all that. And then, yes, he did. A week or two later, Popper gave a lecture at a talk at his own seminar, which was a reply to me. And Imre Lakatos whispered in my ear, you must realize, Nick, this is a great honor to you. Popper never replies from visiting lecturers. And it was true. He didn't, I think, do that to anybody else. But I think Popper never really liked me because he always thought I was sitting there in the audience thinking critical thoughts, which of course I was, because I took Popper seriously. And after all, it's pretty basic to Popper's philosophy that one should have the critical attitude. So even though all my work really in a kind of way comes out of Popper's work, although that isn't altogether how I think of it, because I was thinking about these issues before I knew anything about Popper, nevertheless I've been enormously influenced by Popper. Popper himself never had much time for me or for my work.
So I really enjoy that story because it seems to, if you could see how much I'm smiling right now, Nick, you'd understand. It explains so much about Popper and that circle as well. It's really quite interesting for people like myself. And of course, the names you roll off as friends of yours, a remarkable list of names. But one more part on that, you were also witness to a certain type of almost folklore about Karl Popper. So you witnessed him do this almost event that he would do when he would say, observe, and then sit blankly and stare back at the audience. So you saw him do this. So I might get you to explain that briefly, because I was almost under the impression that was just a piece of myth or folklore almost, but you saw it for yourself. And I wonder if you found it very impressive and explain the philosophical problem that Popper was getting at there.
Well, he was making the point in. I think this happened. Imre Lakatos asked me to take tutorials at the LSE for the students who were doing Popper's introductory course in the philosophy of science. So without consulting Popper himself, and Popper was furious when he heard that I was doing this, although he was nice to me on that occasion. But I gathered through the rumor mill that he was not at all pleased that he hadn't been consulted about it, and I understood that, because I wouldn't like that to happen if I was giving a course. So I used to go along to Popper's lectures, and they were really rather extraordinary, because Popper was very. They were very simple. They were very elementary, very basic stuff. He was really determined to get across the basic points that he has to make about science, about scientific method, about how science proceeds, and what it provides us with. So he would make these very simple points, like I remember him very emphatically saying that anybody who doesn't understand that our ignorance is a vast realm far greater than the realm of our knowledge, hasn't been properly taught science. We should always appreciate that there is this great ocean of ignorance before us that science is trying to come to grips with. His point about observation was that he was really trying to get across the point that it makes nonsense to say observe. Observe what? You have to have a problem. There have to be background theories that you're trying to test. Maybe two or more that then give a point to observation and to experiment. But without that, without theories that you're considering, observation doesn't make sense. So this was part of his argument against an inductivist approach to science, the very sort of orthodox idea, perhaps not so orthodox these days because of Popper's influence, that science begins with observation and then generalizes and gradually comes to develop laws and theories, which was absolutely anathema as far as Popper was concerned.
So let's move from that, shall we? So let's talk about problems and how your particular philosophy is going to diverge from Popper's. And through my reading here, it seems to circle a lot around the problem of falsification. So I might get to start there. I know there is a lot more to it here. There's about metaphysical assumptions and unity of knowledge, for example. But I might get to start on falsifiability and the problems that you began to see with Popper's theory. I suppose you should also get to explain exactly what Popper meant as well by that.
By falsifiability, well, his sort of key idea, really, the key idea of the logic of scientific discovery is that scientific theories can be falsified by evidence. A factual statement, like all events have a cause, for example, can't be falsified by evidence, because if you discover an event which doesn't seem to have a cause, well, who knows, perhaps it does, you just haven't found it. So it's not really a falsifiable statement, but Popper's claim was that really it's basic to scientific statements that they're falsifiable, not verifiable, but falsifiable. And science advances, it improves our conjectural knowledge of the world by subjecting our guesses, our theories, to attempted falsification by deriving consequences which are then checked against observation and experiment. And then when we discover that a theory gives a false prediction and is falsified, because it only needs one false prediction to falsify a theory, then we're forced to try to think of something better that has greater empirical content, that is, predicts more phenomena, predicts everything the old theory predicts successfully, and more phenomena as well. And so science advances by this process of conjecture and refutation. Yes?
Yes, so what exactly was the issue that you found with this? I believe the issue that you're struggling with, but the reason you veer away from this is that you have a belief that this doesn't account for progress in some way, that if you falsify a theory, then it doesn't necessarily mean you're moving forward. Have I misinterpreted you here?
Well, the problem with this is that given that we have a theory that is provisionally accepted because it's falsifiable, it has successfully predicted lots of phenomena and hasn't yet been falsified, we can always think up endlessly many rival theories that are at least as acceptable according to Popper's methodology as the theory we accept. And in fact, we can concoct theories that are even more acceptable. We can there are infinitely many theories that agree with the given theory for all observations and experiments that we've already done, but then make bizarre predictions for the future or for phenomena that we haven't yet observed, and simply declare, if for example, the accepted theory was Newton's theory of law of gravitation, we could postulate that in 2050, gravitation will suddenly become, instead of being an attractive force, it'll suddenly become a repulsive force, and we'll all fly off into the air, and the Earth will shoot off away from the sun. Well, probably this will get refuted in 2050, but so far it's had all the predictive success of Newton's law. And then we can add on additional postulates that are independently testable and have had and have been corroborated. That is, their predictions have been successful. And in this way, we can concoct a rather ugly theory, which is an even better theory from the point of view of Popper's methodology. That is, it predicts more than the accepted theory, and some of its extra predictions have been found to be successful. That is exactly the requirements, according to Popper, which should lead us to accept this theory. But in practice, physicists would never accept such a theory because it's horribly ugly. It's a sort of mishmash of different postulates stuck together, and it lacks coherence. It's not unified. And so my basic objection to Popper is that there are always these two requirements that a theory has to satisfy. It must be more empirically successful than any other theory, and it must be sufficiently unified. And what that means is that the theory says the same thing for all the phenomena to which it applies. You can't have a theory that says, for this range of phenomena, you have such and such a law, an inverse square law, or if it's Newton. And then for this range of phenomena, we have an inverse cube law, and for this range of phenomena, we have something else. We can't have a sort of hodgepodge theory like that. The theory has to say that the same laws apply to all the phenomena to which the theory applies. So there are these two requirements. And what that means is if physics is only ever accepting unified theories, then there is this built-in assumption in the whole enterprise of physics that there is in nature some kind of underlying unity. And how do we know that the world is like that? We don't. Or I totally agree with Popper that ultimately all our knowledge is conjectural in character. So what we need to do is, instead of pretending that this assumption isn't there, we need to make it explicit so that we can critically assess it and try to improve it as we proceed. And what I go on to do is specify a methodology which facilitates that, which gives us the best chance of improving the implicit metaphysical assumptions of physics, of science, as we proceed. So the fundamental difference between me and Popper is that for Popper, the basic aim of science is truth, nothing being presupposed about the truth. For me, science can't proceed like that. It has to, the basic aim is rather the basic aim of theoretical physics, and therefore at a fundamental level of the whole of natural science, is to discover the underlying unity in nature that we presuppose, and we have to presuppose in order to proceed, exists. And so it's a quite basic disagreement about the aim of science and so of the methods of science.
So I'm guessing that, and what I'm inferring from your answer there is that you believe that science has a place for metaphysical theories, or metaphysical theories have a place within science. And this is something that Popper wouldn't allow for, especially by joint of his demarcation criteria.
Yes. Popper's contributions to the philosophy of science really began with his solution to the demarcation problem as he saw it. How do we demarcate science from metaphysics, science from non-science? And that was his key idea, that in order to be scientific, a theory has to be empirically falsifiable. What I claim is that my argument shows that this persistent preference for unified theories in the teeth of endlessly many, strictly speaking, infinitely many, empirically more successful disunified theories means that there is this implicit assumption. So it's not really me asserting this, it's the argument that's asserting this, that there is this big implicit untestable metaphysical assumption built into the methodology of physics, built into the persistent preference for unified theories over endlessly many empirically more successful disunified rivals. This goes on all the time. This argument is sort of an elaboration of David Hume's argument in connection with the problem what we now call the problem of induction, that nature can always change its course. Well, it isn't just in time. One can think of phenomena that we haven't observed, and we probably never will observe. I mean, you could imagine, one of the examples I give is supposing we imagine a version of Newton's law of gravitation, which says everything happens as Newton's law asserts, except for gold spheres weighing 10,000 tons, circulating out there in outer space. For all gold spheres, pure gold spheres of over 10,000 tons, there is a quite different law, an inverse cube law, or gravitation is repulsive. You can do whatever you like. Well, actually, we'll probably never put that to the test. It would be a rather expensive experiment to perform. And actually, in fact, we probably all are pretty convinced that insofar as Newton's law applies, it would apply to those phenomena as well, which shows how firmly convinced we are of this idea that there is this kind of underlying unity in nature.
So Popper seems to slip in a response to this of sorts. I'm not sure if it's a response to you exactly, but a response to this kind of criticism of his, or of course this question of unity and ad hoc theories. So the reason why we perhaps don't test that theory is something that he calls the requirement of simplicity, or not. So I might get a touch on what he meant by that and why that isn't a good response to why we don't test these elaborate extra ad hoc theories.
Okay. Popper put forward two versions of simplicity. Two answers to the question, what is the simplicity of a theory? But the one that matters is the one that he puts forward in The Logic of Scientific Discovery, because he says this one takes precedence over the other one. And Popper simply says, given two theories, that theory which has the greater empirical content is the simpler. So Popper identifies simplicity with empirical content. Empirical content means the range of the phenomena that the theory predicts. What it says, in other words, about the world. But the problem with this is that you can easily increase the empirical content of a theory by adding on arbitrary, independently testable postulates. And in doing that, in terms of the intuitive notion of simplicity, you would be making the theory horribly, horribly complicated. So Popper's notion of simplicity doesn't really work and doesn't do justice to the notion that in fact operates in physics. And the notion that in fact operates is the one that I indicated earlier, namely that the key notion is not really simplicity, it's basically unity. And the crucial requirement is that a theory says the same thing for all the phenomena to which the theory applies. You could imagine, in a slightly more detailed way, putting it like this, that you could imagine a theory that actually says 6 or 8 different things for different phenomena. For one range of phenomena, there is such and such a law, and then for another range, a slightly different law, and for another range, a slightly different law. So you have 6 different domains in which the theory asserts slightly different things, different laws. Well, such a theory would have a degree of disunity of 6, n equals 6. For unity, you require n to equal 1. That is, what the theory asserts is the same throughout its whole range of the phenomena, the possible and actual phenomena to which it applies. That's the notion that actually operates in physics. That's the kind of unity that physicists seek. And it's the actual requirement that an acceptable theory has to satisfy, and in Conjectures and Refutations, Popper does say some things. He introduces a new requirement of simplicity, and he does, in a sort of rather generalized way, try to hint at such a notion, but confesses that he thinks there's a problem with spelling it out clearly. Well, that's a problem that Popper didn't solve, and I did solve, and the solution makes it clear that in persistently accepting unified theories in the sense that I've just explicated it, and rejecting infinitely many disunified theories that are even empirically more successful, that could always be concocted, we are thereby making a big assumption about the nature of the universe, a big metaphysical assumption, an untestable assumption, which goes right against, in a sense, Popper's specific philosophy of physics, but not the basic spirit of Popper, because the whole point of my argument is that there is this big assumption lurking, implicit in the methodology of physics, lurking in the whole enterprise of science. And precisely for Popperian reasons, we need to make this highly problematic assumption explicit so that we can criticize it and try and improve it. If we look at the metaphysics of physics from sort of Descartes' time or Galileo's time to ours, we see that our ideas about the sort of way in which we guess the universe might be physically comprehensible or unified have changed dramatically a number of times. We've discovered that ideas that we took for granted at one stage have turned out to be hopelessly false at a later stage, which is just a further underlying of the point that this big assumption that influences not only the direction in which we seek for new theories, but also influences the theories that we accept, is the specific assumption that's accepted at any stage in the development of physics is almost bound to be false. The current assumption, the most widely held assumption is probably string theory, that everything is made up of tiny little quantum strings in 10 or 11 dimensions of space-time. And that's probably wrong too, and we'll need to revise that idea as well. So that's the basic argument. At a fundamental level, it's highly Popperian. At the more specific level, it contradicts Popper because it says there is this big metaphysical conjecture built into the whole enterprise of physics, which is highly problematic, very likely to be false, and therefore we need for rationality, to give us the best chance of making progress, we need to make this implicit assumption explicit so that we can criticize it and try to improve it as we proceed.
So before we get on to your improvement and your response to Popper to fill in that gap, there is just one last thing I'd want to touch on before we move on, and that is, I think it's important just to a very brief explanatory moment here, because people who going back, and I'm going to link your works below reading them, are probably going to bump into two terms. I think you've done a pretty good job of answering so far, but they might need just a little bit of clarifying for people that bump into them ad hoc, so to speak. So you have two types of falsification. You categorize them as bare falsificationism and dress falsificationism. So I might get you to distinguish what you mean by those two, and why, of course, they're both false, which, of course, you've done a fair bit so far, and then we can jump into aim-oriented empiricism. Okay.
Well, bare empiricism is the doctrine that Popper expounds in The Logic of Scientific Discovery. One of the really wonderful things about The Logic of Scientific Discovery is that everything really devolves from this key notion of falsification, of falsifiability. It has this wonderful structure, everything that Popper pulls out of this comes from this basic single notion, which I think is a marvelous achievement, and also makes it very much more straightforward in a way to criticize, rather than something that is, just this great kind of lump of different things cobbled together. So for example, he tries to define simplicity in terms of falsifiability and empirical content. In Conjectures and Refutations, Popper puts forward this new requirement of simplicity, where he says a new theory, in order to be acceptable, must stem from a simple unifying idea. And he gives a sort of intuitive characterization of the idea of unity of theory that I spelled out more explicitly earlier. And so dressed falsifiability is the doctrine of the logic of scientific discovery with that extra requirement of simplicity. So, which does better justice to what goes on in physics and in natural science. But then you have the problem of what exactly does one mean by this, and what is the justification for accepting this, or what reason do we have for supposing that proceeding in accordance with this principle is going to give us a better chance of improving our knowledge than proceeding in accordance with some other principle?
So let's step from that into the real core of this, which is your response to Popper, or your response to those problems that we've brought up so far that you found within Popper, which is a theory that you call aim-oriented empiricism. So I want you to touch on that, and I'll just let listeners know that there is a hierarchy and a little graph of sorts, little structure that I'm going to attach below the podcast. So as Nick talks through hierarchies of information and knowledge here, if you are interested or you're losing it a little bit, just click below the podcast and you can see for yourself. Okay, Nick, so take us there. What exactly is AOE?
Well, so there is, what I've argued so far is that we really ought to see physics as making this big assumption that there is underlying unity in nature. In other words, there's a unified pattern of physical law yet to be discovered that runs through all phenomena. That there is a true theory of everything, as physicists call it these days, that predicts in principle, not in practice, of course, all physical phenomena, and it's unified and true. But this is a massive assumption. How do we know that the universe is like that? We don't. And inevitably, at some stage in physics, we don't just assume that. We have a much more specific version of that assumption that we adopt. So my proposal is that we represent this problematic assumption in the form of a hierarchy of assumptions, I said. And as we go up the hierarchy, the assumptions become less and less substantial, and so more likely to be true, because the less you say, the better your chance, under things being equal, of being true. If you don't say anything, you're bound to be true. And then as your assumptions get, your assertions get more substantial, the greater the chance that you're saying something false. So, and also, as we go up the hierarchy, the assumptions become such that they really do need to be true if science or the pursuit of knowledge is going to be possible at all. So at the top, we have the assumption the universe is such that we can acquire some knowledge of our local circumstances to make sufficient to make life possible. Well, if that is false, we've more or less had it, whatever we assume. So even though we have no grounds whatsoever to suppose that this is true, or it will continue to be true, we have nothing to lose in making that assumption. Because if it's false, we've had it anyway. So we might as well adopt that assumption. And then the next assumption down is that the universe is such that we can develop an idea about the universe which enables us to improve our methods as we proceed. In other words, the universe is such that we can learn how to learn. We can improve the methods of science as we proceed. And then below that, we have a version of this, namely that the universe is such, the universe is comprehensible. There is some kind of explanation for everything that happens, the same kind of explanation, but it's completely open as to what it is. So it might be that there is God who is in control and everything happens in accordance with the will of God, and that's the explanation for everything that occurs. Or it might be that there is some kind of cosmic purpose and everything that occurs in order to fulfill this cosmic purpose. Or there might be, as some people have suggested, that there's a sort of cosmic computer program and everything occurs in accordance with this program. Or it might be that there is a unified pattern of physical law and everything occurs in accordance with this unified pattern of physical law. And then the next one down is just that assumption, that there is this unified pattern of physical law. And then the next assumption, which we might call physicalism, and then the next assumption down is a specific version of that, which today might be string theory. And then we have below that our theories, Einstein's general theory of relativity, and the standard model, as it's called, the quantum field theory of particles and fields. And below that we have evidence. And that's the kind of structure. And then, so the idea is that as science proceeds, there's a sort of two-way influence between theory and evidence, because theories can lead us to question evidence that challenges the theory. It isn't always the case. It often is the case that the theory is wrong, but sometimes it turns out the experiments haven't been done properly. When they are done, it's actually the theory that is right and the experiments are wrong. Well, the same with the metaphysics immediately above our theories, that as we develop new theories, so we may adjust our metaphysical assumptions. We're less but the higher we go in the hierarchy, and the less substantial the assumptions become, the less likely to be wrong, the more resistance there is to modification, to change. So we have a kind of more or less fixed framework of assumptions and associated methods high up in the hierarchy that are more or less permanent, and in the top two cases are permanent. And then within that, the assumptions lower down in the hierarchy that are much more substantial are revised, can be revised in the light of developing theoretical knowledge in physics. One of the really striking things about science is the way in which new knowledge enables us to improve our methods for improving knowledge. And you see this going on all the time at the experimental level. New theories lead to the development of new instruments, from telescopes and microscopes to particle accelerators and so on. And then these new instruments enable us to further improve our knowledge. Well, what I'm arguing is that this kind of interplay of improving knowledge leading to improving methods for improving knowledge also goes on at the theoretical level. That as we improve our theories, we improve our metaphysics, which then improve our methods, and so improve our strategies for the development of new and better theories. Well, one of the big differences between my conception of scientific method and Popper's is that within the view that I call Aim-Oriented Empiricism, there is a method of discovery, something which Popper denies the existence of, that as a result of thinking about the clashes between current metaphysical conjectures and our best theories, and the clashes between theories and theories, we can develop new, better theories. It's a method of discovery that Einstein used in developing special and general relativity, and it's been used subsequently in developing quantum field theories.
So is this also, there's a wonderful piece of language that you use when you describe AOE, or Aim-Oriented Empiricism, as more Popperian than Popper. And that is, I'm taking that from your answer there, is because it allows us to criticize more than Popper did. It increases the scope of criticism into realms that Popper didn't account for by his theory.
Yes, yeah. Yes, exactly. That what I'm arguing is that as a result of acknowledging what is at present in a way implicit metaphysical assumptions of physics, we expose these assumptions to criticism, and so to improvement as a result of critical appraisal, and this hierarchical framework of Aim-Oriented Empiricism facilitates that. It concentrates criticism where it is most needed, low down in the hierarchy. It's not going to be very fruitful for us to criticize the top assumption that the universe is such that we can acquire some knowledge of our local circumstances sufficient to make life possible. That criticism of that assumption is not likely to help much with the improvement of knowledge. But as we go down the hierarchy of assumptions to something like quantum string theory, for example, well, that may be a very good thing to look very critically at that assumption, because that assumption is quite likely to be false. And so in need of improvement, development, modification.
So fundamentally here, correct me if I'm wrong, your theory here adds a degree of probability, of probabilism to Popper, in a sense that it gives people a much firmer guidepost on where to attach their criticisms and their efforts. So is it wrong to say it's a more probabilistic form of falsificationism?
No, I think that is wrong. As far as methodology is concerned, I mean, I agree with Popper about quantum theory and being fundamental. In fact, I go further than Popper on that. And Popper didn't like what I had to say about quantum theory at all, but I corresponded with him about it. But as far as methodology is concerned, no, there isn't a probabilistic aspect to it. But I would say that first of all, there is the difference. We have to remember that the whole point of criticism is to improve our knowledge. And I think I'm more aware of this, or I want to stress this more than Popper does. If we can show that criticizing some thesis is not going to be very productive from the point of view of improving knowledge, then it's entirely rational not to subject it, not to waste time criticizing it. We have to direct our criticism at what is going to be most fruitful for us to criticize from the point of view of improving knowledge. And that's a big part of the point of having this hierarchy of assumptions. It enables us to disentangle what is worth criticizing, what is likely to be fruitful to criticize, from what is less likely to be fruitful to criticize. But the grounds for saying some is more fruitful than others is not exactly probabilistic. It's rather, if this is false, we've had it whatever we assume. So if this is false, there can't be anything fruitful in the conjecture that this is false, because if it is false, we've had it. You know, we're not going to be able to survive, acquire the knowledge we need. It's a very simple point that the simplest action that we perform in our lives requires us to acquire new knowledge about our surroundings.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. So how do we get from this to Thomas Kuhn? Because again, and I love the language here, you write your theory is more Popperian than Popper and more Kuhnian than Kuhn. And it's really evocative. It's great. But I wonder how you get to Kuhn, because many people, I might get you to briefly explain what Kuhn did with his theories of normal science and paradigm shifts, etc. But many people might have this idea that, in fact, it's not very fruitful to criticize the paradigm. In fact, it's much more fruitful to work within perhaps normal science. So I wonder, I might get you to briefly explain, very briefly, what Kuhn was, of course, and what his theory was. But also, what do you mean when you take a step beyond Kuhn and improve upon him as well?
Yes, well, Kuhn thought that, at least in the structure of scientific revolutions, he thought that science was this process of normal science and then intermittent revolutionary science and then back to normal science again. The normal science is when there is some paradigm, as he calls it, which is really the basic theory that in the discipline that everyone sort of more or less takes for granted. And the task of normal science is to extend the paradigm to more and more phenomena. So they predict the phenomena. And what is right about Kuhn, and something that Popper rather neglects, is that actually this is it can be a very difficult thing to do, to extend the predictive capacity of a theory that we have to solve the equations and to show that it actually does predict such and such a process, such and such a phenomenon, such an experimental result. And Popper rather, in Popper's account, it almost seems as if it's a kind of trivial matter, but in fact it isn't a trivial matter, and a lot of science is taken up with exactly doing that, and that's something that Kuhn emphasizes and Popper rather ignores. So that Kuhn does sort of in a kind of way score over Popper, that there is this important activity which Kuhn describes as normal science. What is really bad about Kuhn, and which is what horrifies Popper. Popper calls Kuhn, in a comment in Criticism and the Growth of Knowledge, he says Kuhn's doctrine of normal science, which Popper says I discovered anyway long before Kuhn did. It's a danger to science and indeed to civilization. So he's very devastating about it, and one can see why, because what Kuhn is saying is that scientists ought not to be looking critically at this paradigm. And for Popper, this is kind of absolutely anathema, because it completely contradicts his whole philosophy of science. And here, my sympathies are with, well, they're kind of mixed in a way, but my sympathies are basically with Popper, because I think everything should be open for scrutiny. And after all, there can be division of labor. Not everyone needs to be doing normal science type activities. They can also be thinking about fundamental questions. And of course, this is what happens in science. There's a division of labor. One big division of labor is between experimentalists and theoreticians, and they're doing very different things, and both are needed for the scientific enterprise. So and then furthermore, you can have scientists thinking about metaphysical issues, which doesn't so much go on these days, because, well, it does, but informally, as it were. My sympathies are here with Popper, and I think Kuhn simply got it wrong. But the point is that if you could say that what I am arguing is that there is a kind of power for paradigms. There is this big assumption built into the whole scientific enterprise, which has a far greater permanence in the scientific enterprise. If we think of modern science as really sort of beginning with Galileo and Kepler, both Galileo and Kepler thought that there was a kind of simple mathematical structure to the universe. Simple laws govern phenomena like the orbit of the planets around the sun, or the way in which stones fall near the Earth's surface, that you could capture motions in terms of simple laws, and these simple laws be found to govern all the phenomena of the natural world. Well, that's sort of the beginning of the assumption of underlying unity, as I explicated it earlier, but it has sort of evolved since Kepler's ideas and Galileo's ideas. What I have to say is an improvement over Galileo and Kepler. So there has been a kind of evolution, but nevertheless, physics has stuck with that idea and has been pursuing it and developing it ever since. So at this metaphysical level, there is something in science which is much more like the kind of thing that Kuhn calls a paradigm. So there is a kind of element of normal science in the whole enterprise from Galileo to today, but it also accommodates revolutions. It accommodates the revolution of Newtonian mechanics, and then of James Clerk Maxwell's electrodynamics, and then Einstein's special relativity and general relativity, and then quantum theory and quantum field theory and quantum chromodynamics and the Standard Model, and attempts today to develop string theory. So there is revolution of theory, but there are revolutions in more specific metaphysical ideas. But at some level, at the level of physicalism, the idea that there is this underlying unity in nature, that has evolved, but it has been kind of with us as a persistent theme, a persistent assumption within natural science since Galileo and Kepler. So there is a kind of Kuhnian element to science, according to my view, that Popper certainly doesn't do justice to.
So from that, you also talk about Lakatos, and this is, of course, the man at the very start of our discussion who whispered in your ear, "This is a great honor, Nick." Yeah, and you step beyond him. So he, in some ways, tries to unify the gap between Popper and Kuhn. And again, you have some sympathies with him, but again, you step beyond him. But there's a very interesting moment towards the end of the book I was reading of yours, where you write here, and I'm going to quote here, it says, effectively, you said, "It makes me wonder whether Lakatos might have gone on to develop or endorse AOE if he had lived." So you begin to sense a tone within Lakatos that he was moving in the direction of your theory in some ways, because he talks about his attempts to unify Popper and Kuhn, but he does so, and I'm going to quote again here, he says, "But it does so in an ad hoc and not fact correcting, and if you wish, basic value correcting way." And that's in some ways a touch or perhaps a pre-echo of your theory in some ways.
Yes, Imre's problem was how to do justice to Kuhn and how to do justice to Popper. And his solution was to say, well, if we see science as competing fragments of Kuhn's normal science, then we have both Kuhn, because there are these chunks of Kuhnian normal science going on, where there is a paradigm, as it were, although Lakatos used the word hardcore rather than paradigm. But we also have Popper, because we have this idea that there are competing programs of Kuhnian normal science. So and the important issue is which of two competing programs of Kuhnian normal science is being the most empirically progressive. That is, which one is successfully predicting new phenomena, and which one has to sort of try and keep up with the other one by adjusting its paradigm to accommodate phenomena that have been discovered by the other party, as it were. And so there is no way of making an instant judgment as to which is the most empirically successful. But if we look at it over time, then we can see one as being more empirically progressive than the other one. And Lakatos is absolutely emphatic that within the sort of overall context of the two or possibly more rival Kuhnian chunks of normal science, programs of normal science, there is this Popperian idea that the basic aim is truth, and we are in the end allowing empirical success and failure to determine which theory or which program or which hardcore we accept and which one we reject. It's just that in Lakatos's framework, everything has become much more provisional. For Popper, there is such a thing as pretty well as instant refutation. A theory may just predict something startlingly false, and there's nothing you can do about it. The theory has been refuted. For Imre Lakatos, this, according to him, this doesn't really happen in science. It's always a process of time, that you have to see whether this research program is being more empirically progressive than a rival research program. People have argued about this and decided that produce sort of scientific evidence that actually in physics itself there are refutations, and I think that's probably correct, that there are. But in any case, what Imre Lakatos was developing was very different from what I was arguing for, and because his fundamental framework was Popperian. The basic aim is truth. The basic method is assessment of progress, of programs, of rival programs, rather than rival theories, in terms of their empirical progressiveness. So he didn't at all have the idea that there is, as it were, a paradigm or a hardcore for the whole scientific enterprise, which in a sort of way you could say is what I'm advocating.
So let's do the Popperian thing here. And I think by throwing some criticisms and some queries at you, as the Popperian thing to do is, I think the details of your theory will come out much clearer for the audience and for myself. And I will ask some questions. I'm sure you're going to find some of these slightly annoying or stupid or not as relevant as they should be. But I'm going to start with some, and I'll get you to knock them down one by one as we go. And I have to apologize because I know a lot of these you've probably encountered again and again over the years, because I've seen you corresponding with people across the years and the decades across these things. But I might start with a first one here, a first criticism here, and that is... So when you see evidence, it reveals that unity is there within science. but perhaps it's just the success of science, as in it's not an axiom or an a priori aspect of science. It's just a result of science. It comes about. So why is it just not something that comes about on the basis of evidence that comes from science, rather than this axiom that we should accept about science?
Well, there is a part of my argument that I didn't go into because it's kind of a bit wearisome and intricate. But that there is, given any unified theory that we accept, any of the great theories, Newton, Maxwell, Einstein, quantum theory, and so on, there are always infinitely many rival, disunified, but empirically more successful theories that can be in principle concocted. There are endlessly many that can be concocted. The idea that the scientific progress just reveals that nature is unified obtains only if you neglect all these rivals. And on what basis do you neglect all these rivals? If they are more empirically successful, if we're good empiricists, if we think evidence alone decides in the end what theories we should accept and reject, on what grounds do we reject all these infinitely many empirically more successful theories? That's the question one has to consider. In fact, see, my point is that, on the contrary, what the evidence shows is that nature is horribly complicated, and we refuse to accept that. We persistently refuse to accept it. So, that's actually what goes on in science.
So on that as well, many people may be thinking, is science really this unified? Because I bet they can imagine things, fields like genetics or particle physics or many aspects of science, and they may think to themselves, perhaps science just isn't this unified. So is it true that the history of science reveals this deep unity, or is it a certain novel aspect within certain fields like physics that doesn't correspond to other aspects of knowledge?
Well, of course, we have to appreciate that, again, throughout I'm assuming that, and we could talk about this, but I'm assuming that physics is the fundamental branch of natural science. And in principle, not in practice, but in principle, physical theory applies to all phenomena, including all of biology, even though there may be things going on in the biological world that physics can't predict. I mean, I'm of the view that the experiential domain is beyond the reach. It exists. Colors, sounds, smells, as we experience them, our inner experiences really do exist and are beyond the range of physics. So physics, there's more in your universe, in your world, than physics can predict. But everything that occurs is within the realm of physics to predict with that proviso. We have to remember that as science, as physics has advanced, its predictive content has grown absolutely astronomically. What our two basic theories can predict, this is especially the case with the advent of quantum theory, because quantum theory has the capacity to predict the properties of matter, the whole range of chemical phenomena. A vast domain of diverse phenomena is brought within the province of this one theory of quantum theory. So the miracle of physics is that you'd think that if the predictive content of physics increases so vastly, that this would come with it an increase in disunity. But this isn't the case. There is also considerable unity. But of course, it's true that our current fundamental theories are disunified. Quantum theory clashes horribly with general relativity. The Standard Model clashes with general relativity. And it's that clash which has led to the hope of a whole army of theoretical physicists that string theory might be the solution to it. And there are other approaches. But at the fundamental level, the fundamental problem of theoretical physics is to discover how to find a theory that unifies general relativity on the one hand and the Standard Model on the other hand, and also predicts new phenomena as well, like dark matter, for example. So without question, there is disunity in science, but that's because, as Popper so correctly emphasized, we have a lot of knowledge, conjectural knowledge, but we're also ignorant. There are still things to be discovered.
I'm going to lob a criticism at you now that I'm sure
yes.
Probably the one that you hate the most, simply because it seems to come up the most. So I should throw it at you now. That is the claim that what your theory is a form of justificationism here. And I see this come at you a lot, and I've read in your book a number of times you pushing back on this, saying this is just a misreading of your theory. So I might get you to start there on that as well, because it seems to be a very common quick criticism that people throw back at you here, and one that you are very quick to notice and very quick to respond to.
Yes, that does baffle me, because as I've emphasized in expounding Aim-Oriented Empiricism, the basic idea is that there is this big implicit assumption built into the methods of physics, built into the persistent selection of unified theories only, even though there are always empirically more successful disunified theories that are available. And so the whole emphasis of my argument is far from being justificational. It's entirely a Popperian argument that since there is this big assumption built in implicitly into the methods of physics, it needs to be made explicit so that we can criticize it and try and improve it. I mean, that is absolutely a fundamentally Popperian argument, if ever, that seems to me to be more or less the heart of Popper's philosophy, philosophy of science and his epistemology. So I find that baffling. I think it's just the result of not bothering to attend to what I'm actually arguing.
So as I was reading through your work the last few weeks, I came across a criticism that David Miller had of you, and I might put that one to you now. And he picks up on a simple phrase that you use. So this is you writing, in persistently excluding infinitely many empirically successful but grossly ad hoc theories, science in effect makes a big assumption about the nature of the universe. And David Miller picks up on that phrase, in effect. And he says, by focusing on this in effect, you are making a big assumption that there's this hole there, and you're trying to fill it in with some sort of information, and you filled it in through that particular phrase, in effect, and tried to build out your theory. And he goes on to say at a number of times here that, in fact, that's not the truth, and he compares it to a theory about God, and this is him here. He says, my point was that the failure of most, if not all, contemporary scientific theories to mention God does not imply that science assumes there is no God, as there's no atheistic assumption. And of course, you respond to David Miller, but I might get you to respond again now and tell us why Miller is wrong here with his criticism.
Well,
there's a lot there, I know.
If let us suppose that physicists, a community of physicists, persistently only considered, only developed and put to the test of experiment theories that postulate atoms. And there were some other physicists who kind of probably didn't have the qualifications or something to belong to this group of physicists who had developed theories that postulate fields rather than atoms that were much more successful empirically than the atomic theories. But the community of physicists just completely ignore these theories, refuse to even consider them. I think it's not unreasonable to take the view that this group of physicists is just dogmatically assuming that the universe is made up of atoms, that the only kind of theory they're prepared to consider demonstrably are theories that postulate atoms. And all other theories that postulate other entities, and we can assume there are other theories as well that are more empirically successful, they just get ignored. If that is the case, then that in itself just amounts to making a big assumption about the phenomena, about the world. How does it not?
What was Popper's criticism? Do you remember back all those years ago? Do you remember what his criticism was? That would be a fascinating.
Well, Popper does discuss in one of his later books. He does talk about silly theories, I think he calls them, or something like that, that can be concocted. And what he says is very unsatisfactory. He said we should leave it to scientists to fight for their theories. But my rejoinder in one of my publications is to point out that the argument about the existence of these empirically more successful disunified rivals is that this refutes Popper's methodology, because Popper's methodology says that these empirically more successful disunified theories should be the ones that physicists accept according to his methodology, and they don't. They ignore them. So this is if anything, it's a straight refutation of Popper's methodology. Well, Popper would be outraged by scientists ignoring refutations. I think he should follow suit. If there is an argument which shows that scientific practice straightforwardly refutes his methodology, it's something that he should take seriously and not kind of try to push aside with bluster, which is in effect what he does. So, he didn't really have his only satisfactory response is to appeal to his principle of the principle of simplicity that he formulates in conjectures and refutations. But there's a problem with that as well.
So why is it, do you think, that your theory hasn't caught on? And this is another thing that you write about in some detail. And here you have some sympathy with the failings of the philosophical and scientific community with Popper in a way as well. But why is it, do you think, that it hasn't? Why it's a certain neglect of your theory within the philosophy of science?
Well, I think that the doctrine that I call standard empiricism, that in the end science is this issue of theory and evidence, is a kind of dogma that really does dominate science and our whole, not just among scientists, but non-scientists as well think of science in that light. Scientists endlessly repeat it and emphasize that's how science differs from everything else. It differs from politics and religion because there are no articles of faith. And in a kind of way, my Aim-Oriented Empiricism says, no, on the contrary, there is an article of faith, this underlying unity assumption. Of course, it isn't just an article of faith, because if it's acknowledged and subjected to sustained critical scrutiny as science proceeds, then it's it's an article of faith that is being adopted and accepted conjecturally as the best that we have as a result of sustained ferocious scientific scrutiny. So it's very far from just a dogma. But at present it is but at present it's standard empiricism that is a dogma. And of course the problem with accepting standard empiricism is then that the current metaphysics becomes a dogma because it's not even acknowledged. Unacknowledged assumptions are much more rigidly upheld than ones that one acknowledges and then is prepared to scrutinize and acknowledge their fallibility. So I think that's a part of the problem. Standard empiricism is a dogma, and there are very powerful reasons why scientists want to hold on to that dogma, because it very simplistically differentiates science from everything else and seems to give science this extra prestige. In science, we attend to the evidence. So it's something we've heard in this present pandemic endlessly, the importance of attending to the evidence, following the science. And there is another aspect to it, and that is that this assumption that of underlying unity, or the assumption that the universe is physically comprehensible, and that this metaphysical thesis is a pretty secure item of scientific knowledge insofar as anything theoretical ever can be in science. It's persisted in science since the time of Galileo and Kepler, and informs the whole enterprise of science. It has very disturbing implications for our understanding of human life. If everything that goes on accords with an underlying unity of physical law, that includes us and everything we do and think and feel. So what becomes of human consciousness? What becomes of human freedom? What becomes of the meaning and value of human life? And I've argued a lot about that, and I think it is possible to make sense of the meaning and value of human life and of human freedom within that context. But you can see that it has disturbing consequences. For it emphasizes that issue and highlights it as it isn't just philosophers holding forth about these metaphysical doctrines, but it's actually an integral part of our scientific knowledge and understanding of the world we live in. So it is disturbing for non-scientists, and it's disturbing for scientists. And then there's another aspect to it, and that is that I'm not the first person to suggest that science makes metaphysical assumptions. I'm the first person to put forward this hierarchy view and the importance of improving our assumptions. But Mill, and also Bertrand Russell towards the end of his life, and one or two other people, have put forward this idea that there is this big metaphysical assumption. In both Mill's case and Bertrand Russell's case, in an attempt to solve the problem of induction. And philosophers know in quotation marks, that this doesn't work. That if you try and justify accepting unified theories on the basis that these accord with a metaphysical assumption of unity, and then you justify accepting the metaphysical assumption of unity on the basis that this has led to great empirical progress in science, this is an appallingly viciously circular argument. It's totally invalid because you're assuming the very thing you're trying to prove. Hume was very well aware of the invalidity of this argument as well. So it's a kind of axiom within philosophy and philosophy of science, that this approach to trying to make rational sense of science, of scientific knowledge, of trying to solve the problem of induction is absolutely hopeless. Bas van Frassen somewhere says, everybody knows that this is a mug's game. Well, I have an answer to this. And the answer is that in the hierarchy of theses, not the top assumption, but the next one down is the assumption that the universe is such that we can improve our methods as we proceed. In other words, it's the assumption that we live in a universe which is such that metaphysical assumptions that lead to empirical progress are good assumptions to adopt, likely to lead to real progress in knowledge. And so this kind of, in other words, we live in a universe in which, according to this thesis, in which this kind of feedback mechanism of allowing our theories to influence our metaphysics and our metaphysics to influence our theory is a good one to adopt. It's exactly the procedure we need to adopt in order to improve our knowledge. And the reasons for adopting this assumption, the second one down in the hierarchy of assumptions, make no reference to empirical progress. So they're completely independent of empirical progress. I've spelled this all out most clearly in a book called Understanding Scientific Progress, which was published in 2017, although there are indications of it in earlier publications. So actually there is, within the framework of Aim-Oriented Empiricism, a solution to this problem. But I think the trouble is that philosophers haven't really looked at it, and so they don't know of its existence. So they remain convinced that what I'm proposing is a load of nonsense. It's well known to be hopeless.
You mentioned Einstein earlier on, and his
yeah.
If philosophers of science are not paying the right amount of attention or not doing so in the right way, is it your assertion that science is, in a way? So Karl Popper had this assertion about his theory that even if you didn't understand his theory or you were doing science before Karl Popper came along, you were moving forward through critical rationalism. It is the only way that knowledge can come about. So do you think that science before Maxwell, that science was done, or perhaps only the great scientists or the great breakthroughs are the most ones that were effective, do they have some sort of implicit understanding of your hierarchy in their mind, or is that not possible?
My argument is that physics has put Aim-Oriented Empiricism, something like Aim-Oriented Empiricism, into practice because it has in practice, these two requirements have influenced what theories get accepted and rejected, namely empirical success on the one hand and unity on the other. These two considerations have operated, and that means that physics in practice is much closer to Aim-Oriented Empiricism than it is to standard empiricism, because standard empiricism said there should be no physics, no metaphysics in physics. But if you do that, there is metaphysics, implicit metaphysics in physics. That's what my argument is designed to reveal. But there's more to it than that, because theoretical physicists from as I've tried to stress, from Galileo and Kepler to today, inevitably make in their thinking, they make metaphysical assumptions in the context of discovery, at least in seeking new theories. I I should perhaps add that I think a big part of the problem is Newton. Because, and this is one of the things that I've developed in another book I published in 2017 called In Praise of Natural Philosophy, where I spell this out in some detail in the first 2 chapters. That what I argue there is that modern science began as natural philosophy. In other words, as sort of a version of what I'm arguing for, that there is evidence, the results of observation and experiments, there are theories, there are laws and theories, and then there is a metaphysical assumption that there is some kind that the phenomena are governed by simple laws, like the orbits of planets around the sun and stones thrown near the surface of the Earth, for example. And so what I argue is that is how science began, as an outgrowth of philosophy. Essentially, it was thought of as natural philosophy, and the big assumption was that we must reject Aristotelianism, the idea that purposiveness is in nature, that everything is governed by physical laws, and different thinkers of the time had slightly different ideas about what this metaphysics should be, but they all held one or other version of that idea. Along came Newton, and in the first version of the Principia, he has, I think it is 9 hypotheses, all labeled as hypotheses, some of which are clearly of a metaphysical character. So Newton, the first edition of the Principia, is very much in this tradition of natural philosophy. Although Newton, because of his religious views, didn't altogether go along with the sort of metaphysical views of, say, Descartes. He was very critical of Descartes. And Newton was criticized. The first edition of the Principia received a criticism precisely because it relied on these 9 hypotheses. And Newton hated criticism. So in the second edition and the third edition, he got rid of these hypotheses. Some of the hypotheses became phenomena. You know, there's a big difference between hypothesis and phenomena.
Yes.
They were sort of astronomical phenomena about the orbits of the planets, and some of the hypotheses became rules of reasoning. And actually Newton makes clear that these rules of reasoning do have a metaphysical dimension to them that has to do with simplicity, underlying simplicity or unity. And he makes, for philosophers agree that nature abhors complexity or something along those lines. And then he added extra things to say that science should proceed by means of induction from the phenomena and should not have anything dealings with hypotheses. So he reformulated the Principia so that it looked as if he had derived his law of gravitation, his great achievement, from the phenomena by induction, without resource to hypotheses at all. And it's the enormous prestige of Newton which has cast a kind of shadow over the subsequent development of natural philosophy. It sort of, in effect, destroyed natural philosophy. Natural philosophy quietly died. There was a big debate between France and England, between Newton and Descartes, as to whether Newton's law of gravitation could be accepted because it postulated an attractive force at a distance, which even Newton found unacceptable. He thought that his law showed us how objects moved, but he didn't actually believe in the force of gravitation as a real physical entity. In a letter to someone, he said, anyone who believes that there could be a force across a distance through a vacuum, through empty space, hasn't understood the first thing in philosophy. In other words, he's a complete and utter twit. Well, eventually, even the French accepted Newton about 80 years after Principia was published, or a bit longer. The Newtonian conception of science also got accepted, and natural philosophy, the idea that there is this big metaphysical assumption that the whole enterprise is based on, got forgotten about. And it's disappeared. And the irony of all this is that Newton made this transformation, this enormous change in the whole methodology and epistemology of the Principia, defensively, to obscure the vulnerability of what he was proposing, which is somewhat intellectually disreputable thing to do. If Newton had been more honest about matters and had acknowledged the conjectural dimension and the metaphysical dimension of his work, then science would have developed as natural philosophy, and I think it would have been more successful. Although, of course, one of the problems with this is that science has been so astonishingly successful that everyone assumes that we must have more or less got scientific method right, because look how successful it's been. Well, but as I've indicated, it's not really due to standard empiricism. It's due to the implicit, something approaching Aim-Oriented Empiricism. But it isn't explicitly Aim-Oriented Empiricism. It's still, it's a pretty basic idea of science that there is always room for improvement, even improving our ideas about scientific method. Yeah.
So from that question about success, that was such an interesting story, and it does lead me into a final question here. Popper, when he created his theory, his critical rationalism, he went on to explain how fruitful it was within his life. And of course, the fruitfulness of a theory in that regard doesn't necessarily, if that's justificationism in a sense, you don't want to, it doesn't mean that it is true. But he did go on to expound his theory into other aspects of life. And he did go on to say how fruitful it had been for him. So I wonder if you have experienced a certain amount of fruitfulness from your own theory of knowledge, because it seems as once you do grasp a theory of knowledge that is so successful, it should have import to other fields. And I know, go into your personal website, which I'm going to link below for listeners, I guess you should touch on that as well. You talk about the need for revolution in science and knowledge and the importance of wisdom and all these other aspects here. And it seems as if, looking from the outside, that your theory of knowledge has had some huge import on how your life and your research has gone. So I'm wondering if that is true, and if so, how it has happened.
Well, when I became an occasional student at the LSE, I had this tiny little room, a bed sit. The room was almost smaller than the bed. It was so tiny, near the Oval in London. And I started to read Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, and I was immensely impressed. I remember literally sitting there in this tiny little bedsit, weeping, because at last I'd found someone, a philosopher, talking about what seemed to me to be absolutely fundamental issues about civilization, about the whole story of the open society and its enemy, the movement from a closed tribal society to an open society that tolerates diversity and criticism and learning. And the struggle with it, and how there are these enemies. Some people have said Popper was one of them as well, because he didn't like criticism himself. I was immensely impressed, and what enormously impressed me about Popper's work is the way in which, having developed his philosophy of science, of falsificationism as one may call it, the key notion being falsifiability, he then generalized this notion to a notion of rationality, namely to be rational is to be critical, and then had applied this, above all in the open society, it seemed to me in the open society its enemies, but also elsewhere, to show how fruitful it is if you take seriously this idea that to be rational is to be critical. For example, it transforms one's ideas about what constitutes a rational society and how one evaluates it. One may think of, if you hold sort of pre-Popperian notions of reason, one might think of a rational society as an absolutely horrendous society. It would mean a society dominated by rules of reason, a kind of dictatorship of reason. There's a wonderful novel by a Russian called Zemyatin called We, which gives a sort of marvelous sketch of such a horrendous rule-dominated society. He was satirizing Stalin's Russia, Soviet Union. But if you hold Popper's notion that to be rational is to be critical, well, you can only be critical if there are rival views around. You can't really, there isn't much room for criticism if you live in a tribal society with one view about everything. You have to have rival views before you can begin to start being critical of one view in terms of the assumptions of another view. So a rational society is the open society. It's a society that tolerates diversity of views and values and ways of living. And it absolutely transforms our whole idea about the role of reason in public life. So this was what I found so impressive about Popper. When I started to improve on Popper's philosophy of science, I immediately, well, no, not immediately, but after a while, months. In fact, I remember exactly, there was an occasion when it suddenly occurred to me. I was near where I used to live in Gray's Inn Road in central London. It suddenly occurred to me that I could tread a path parallel to Popper's, just as Popper had generalized his falsifiability notion of scientific method to a general notion of rationality, and then apply it to the problems of social life, public life, political life. I could generalize my improved version of Popper and apply it to everything that Popper had applied his notion of critical rationalism to. But I would have an improved notion of reason. And so the key idea would be that in life, not just in science, but in life, all too often our aims are problematic. We strive to achieve things that have all sorts of undesirable, unforeseen consequences. In fact, this is what we're suffering from today, that as a result of all the enormous increase in power that we've acquired as a result of scientific knowledge and technological know-how, we now have modern industry and modern agriculture, modern travel, modern power production, modern medicine and hygiene, modern armaments, which in many ways have all sorts of wonderful beneficial consequences, but also have led to all our global problems like the climate crisis and the dreadful things we're doing to the natural world, the dreadful loss of wildlife and impending extinction of species, the lethal character of modern war, the menace of nuclear weapons, pollution, the oceans full of plastic, and population growth as well, which is all a part of it. And it's then began to occur to me that if we take seriously the whole academic enterprise as having these two aims, first of all, the intellectual aim of improving our knowledge and understanding, but also the social or humanitarian aim of promoting human welfare, then, and we take this elementary idea of aim-oriented rationality, the generalization of aim-oriented empiricism, there are dreadfully things wrong with the whole academic enterprise that actually, judged from the point of view of helping to promote human welfare, academia, primarily devoted to the pursuit of knowledge, is fundamentally irrational, fundamentally and damagingly irrational. And maybe I should begin to stop with this last remark. But if you take just a straightforward Popperian notion of rationality, that absolutely basic requirements for rationality are that you, if you have a problem, we should think of rationality as having to do with problem solving, then to be rational, to tackle the problem rationally, is to articulate and try to improve the articulation of the problem you're trying to solve, and then propose and critically assess possible solutions. If academia is fundamentally trying to help promote human welfare, then it ought to be giving absolute intellectual priority to the problems that involves, namely our problems of living, the problems we encounter in life, including our global problems. So academia ought to be putting those two rules fundamentally in the whole structure of the enterprise into practice. It ought to be, as a primary intellectual task, articulating and improving the articulation of our problems of living and proposing and critically assessing possible solutions, that is, possible actions, possible political actions, possible political programs, possible policies, possible institutions, modifications of institutions, possible ways of living, philosophies of life. Obviously, we also need to develop new knowledge and new technological know-how, but that ought to be secondary and not the primary intellectual activity. So what this requires, these simple points of that academia ought to be pursuing the aim of helping to promote human welfare, observing the most elementary rules of rational problem solving one can think of. If you take that seriously, it involves a radical revolution in the whole academic enterprise. It means, for example, that the social sciences ought not to be thought of as sciences at all, or even the pursuit of knowledge, but they rather have as their basic task to help people to resolve conflicts and problems of living in more cooperatively rational ways than we do. And the pursuit of knowledge should be of social phenomena, should be conducted so as to get clear about what our problems are, and also to assess critically proposed solutions to our problems, that is, proposed actions, political policies and programs and so on. So it would mean that the social sciences should be thought of as much more as social methodology rather than social philosophy, social science. I mean, in this book I published many years ago in 1984, called From Knowledge to Wisdom, I spelled this all out. But perhaps what I didn't make sufficiently clear is the Popperian roots of what I was arguing for. I have made it clearer subsequently. But essentially what I'm doing is treading a path parallel to Popper's, with an improved conception of scientific method, and then an improved conception of rationality, and then applying it to social problems of living. And indeed, this whole idea really goes back to the 18th century Enlightenment. I think that was the basic idea of the Enlightenment, to learn from scientific progress about how to achieve social progress towards an enlightened world. Unfortunately, the philosophers, especially of the French Enlightenment, got it wrong and thought what that meant was to develop the social sciences alongside the natural sciences. And that idea got developed throughout the 19th century and then built into academia in the 20th century. And we still suffer from it today, the idea that the proper task of academia is to acquire knowledge and then apply it, and not to give priority to our problems of living, and then regard the pursuit of knowledge and technological know-how as emerging out of that and feeding back into it, but not the primary intellectual activity.
So that is a great place to leave the podcast on, with so much to think about for our listeners and to read more about. I'm going to link below the podcast, not just the book that I read in preparation for this podcast, but links to all of Nicholas's books and all of his academic articles you can find, as well as his academic profile, which has that thrust for the future and that search for revolutionary science and the attainment of wisdom over knowledge and things like this. So I'm going to link them all below, and I can't encourage listeners enough. It's been an absolute rare pleasure to talk with you, Nick. I feel like...
Okay.
Sorry?
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just say one more thing?
Of course.
I hope you've come across a book I published last year called Our Fundamental Problem, which is again quite Popperian in basic impulse, as it were. Our fundamental problem being the problem of how our human world can exist and best flourish embedded as it is in the physical universe. And there's another book that's going to come out in April or May of this year called The World Crisis and What to Do About It, a revolution for thought and action.
Well, I will link those two below, and even the pre-published names, so listeners can go and read them for themselves. They're not just interesting books; they're wonderfully easy to read. Flow really well, and I haven't read them. I feel like it's going to take a while for all you've said to sink in and all I've read of yours to sink in, but I feel like I'm a better Popperian. I know more about Popper, haven't read you and haven't spoken to you, so yes, I have to thank you so much. It's been an absolute rare pleasure. Nick Maxwell, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.